I will focus my remarks today on the role played by the Public Health Agency of Canada.
I stated last week, problems in ArriveCAN's design, implementation, oversight, and accountability began early on. Confusion between the Public Health Agency of Canada and the Canada Border Services Agency about their respective roles and responsibilities for the application led to an accountability void that persisted for close to a year and a half. Each believed that the other was responsible for establishing a governance structure, and neither developed or implemented good project management practices, such as developing objectives and goals, and budgets and cost estimates. It's not clear to me how you can responsibly manage spending without a budget or track progress without goals. The Public Health Agency of Canada was the business owner of ArriveCAN until April 1st, 2022. At that date, ownership and responsibilities for ArriveCAN were transferred permanently to the Canada Border Services Agency. In our view, the Public Health Agency, as the business owner, was responsible for establishing the governance structure. Deficiencies in the Public Health Agency of Canada's management of contracts contributed to our concerns about value for money. We found that the agency awarded a professional services tax authorization without using a non-competitive approach. We found no documentation of the initial communications or the reasons why the agency did not consider or select other eligible contractors to carry out the work. Nous avons également constaté
We also found that while the original contract included milestones with clear deliverables and pricing, it was later amended and replaced with less specific deliverables to allow for more flexibility. In addition, the agency did not set out specific tasks, levels of effort, and deliverables for those contracts in task authorizations. In support of transparency and accountability in the use of public funds, the Public Health Agency of Canada should fully document its interactions with potential contractors and the reasons for decisions made during non-competitive procurement processes. Mr. Chair, this concludes my opening remarks. We look forward to answering all questions from the committee. Thank you very much, Ms. Hogan.
5 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to appear before this committee today to discuss the report of the Auditor General on the development of the ArriveCAN application. I'm pleased to join you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I'm joined today by my colleagues Martin Crimmins, Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of the Corporate Management Branch, and Luc Brisebois, Acting Vice President of the Health Security and Regional Operations Branch. Au nom de l'Agence de la Santé Publique du Canada.
On behalf of the Public Health Agency of Canada, I would like to thank the Auditor General and her team for their work. We welcome this report.
The ArriveCAN app took place in the context of Canada's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The Public Health Agency identified the need for an application of this nature stemming from the public health requirement to put measures in place to reduce the introduction and spread of COVID-19 and its variants into Canada. A series of border measures using emergency orders under the Quarantine Act required the collection of public health information from travelers. Initially, this information was collected using a paper form. Due to the volume of travelers entering Canada, the paper forms quickly became operationally inefficient, creating a significant backlog of data and contributing to traveler lineups at airports and border crossings. This made it difficult to fully administer the border measures while still ensuring essential travel and transit of people and critical goods. At the request of the Public Health Agency of Canada, the Canadian Border Services Agency developed an application to digitize this process. This was critical to Canada's ability to rapidly assess, and respond to COVID-19 as it evolved. It allowed the Public Health Agency to better model COVID-19 spread, severity, and trends, to identify variants of concern and travelers from higher risk countries, and to initiate exemptions for essential workers. It informed border measures and subsequently facilitated the safe resumption of international travel. Bien que la vérificatrice générale
While the Auditor General concluded that the speed and quality of the information collected was greatly improved by the ArriveCAN application, the report outlined serious areas of concern in relation to the processes and controls around the application's development.
Canada fully accepts the recommendation that the agency should document interactions with potential contractors as well as the reasons for decisions made during non-competitive procurement processes. We are strengthening our existing guidance and supporting tools and putting in place training with respect to these file documentation requirements. The recommendation directed to the agency also calls for a process to be put in place to ensure compliance with the requirements of contracting policies. The Public Health Agency is updating all of its quality assurance protocols to ensure that these requirements are fully and consistently met. Finally, the findings point to the importance of formally documenting roles and responsibilities at the outset of a project, rather than at a later stage, as was the case with the ArriveCAN application. We believe this finding to be particularly important in the context of emergency response, and it is being incorporated into our preparedness and contingency plans for future emergencies. Thank you. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. I'll now turn to our first questioner. Mr. Barrett, you have the floor for up to 6 minutes, please.
The Auditor General said, and I quote, "The Public Health Agency of Canada did not develop project objectives and goals, budgets and cost estimates, assessments of resource needs, or risk management activities." Ms. Jeffrey, did you develop a budget for ArriveCAN?
There was governance established around ArriveCAN, but it focused on the public health deliverables and the nature of the border measures that needed to be put in place and operationalized through the app.
Okay,
but there was no overall project budget established, as should have been the case in IT projects.
No budget. Was there a projection of the expected cost?
There were initial contracts put in place, but incrementally, as you're aware, those contracts were added to and were administered in sequence. So there was no overarching budget that covered those costs.
Do you believe this failure to have a budget is the reason that the cost of this project ballooned to at least $60 million for taxpayers?
When we look at the situation in Canada in March 2020, it was a novel pandemic, and the timelines and the nature of the response that would be required were not known. This was an evolving situation. I recall when we looked at how...
I appreciate your response, though it is not an answer, and you'll have noted in the Auditor General's report that the pandemic was not an excuse or justification for the rules to be thrown out the window. Your agency owned this app for almost the entirety of the pandemic, and you never developed a cost estimate for it. Did you do any performance reviews on it, quarterly or every 6 months, every year? Did that happen?
The operations of the app were evaluated through a governance structure that included Director General, ADM, and Deputy Management Committees on Border Services, and we assessed the operational results of the app as we went.
But the cost to Canadians was never included in a single review by your department. Is that correct?
The documentation of the cumulative cost was not a part of the documentation of that governance, correct?
Who is the minister ultimately responsible for the Public Health Agency of Canada?
The Public Health Agency of Canada is part of the health portfolio and reports to the Minister of Health, but the contracts that were put in place were put in place.
Who was the Minister of Health that oversaw the development of the ArriveCAN app?
The ArriveCAN app was jointly developed between the Public Health Agency and the Canadian Border Services Agency.
During the time that the ArriveCAN app was first developed, who was the Minister of Health?
At the outset of the pandemic, the Minister of Health was Minister Haidu.
The Auditor General said your agency was responsible for setting the governance structure, which you referenced, which are the rules, procedures, and processes for ArriveCAN. This was your duty at PHAC. That's correct?
Yes.
If PHAC is part of the health portfolio and the Minister of Health was Minister Haidu, then as the minister, she's responsible for this major failing. There was no good news in the Auditor General's report for the government, for the Ministry of Health, or for the Public Health Agency of Canada in that report. So do you recognize that this is a major failing, this $60 million boondoggle?
Mr. Chair, we certainly recognize that the failure to put in place formal project governance at the outset of this project led to inadequate oversight of the project and meant that the costs were not appropriately tracked as they were developed. And we have put in place numerous measures to ensure that this does not happen again. It was a large public health emergency.
I would say that not only was there a failure, it's not acceptable that they weren't tracked. The total cost, is not acceptable. Initial estimates at $80,000 and ballooning to $60 million with single source contracts and, two guys in a basement being paid, $20 million. These are failures. So the minister failed.
The contracts that were put in place were administered by the department.
So let me just be very clear, Ms. Jeffrey. If this is a failure, who is accountable for departmental failures? Is the minister responsible for what goes on in the department?
As the deputy head of the organization,
who does the deputy head report to?
The deputy head reports to the clerk of the Privy Council and to the minister, depending on the subject, and
to the minister
that's being delegated
to the minister, and the authority and responsibilities are delegated from the minister. This is the minister's failure, and that's what's been evidenced in the reporting by the Auditor General.
You're spot on. Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Turning now to Mr. Chen. You have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The emergency orders required the Public Health Agency of Canada to collect contact and health information from travelers entering Canada through the CBSA. We learned from the Auditor General that the report issued indicated that some resources who worked on subcontracts lacked the appropriate security clearance. As the Public Health Agency, I would like to hear your thoughts on this.
The specific contracts that were put in place were from the Canadian Border Services Agency, and a number of resources needed to be replaced given the length of the pandemic. The security and privacy considerations related to the data that was collected were reviewed through numerous assessments, including from the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. And the report was that the measures were complied with privacy and were necessary and proportional to the tasks that needed to be implemented.
In the Auditor General's report in 2021, it stated that the quality of information collected, as well as how quickly it was collected, improved over time with the ArriveCAN app. Understanding the urgency within the context of the global pandemic, would you agree that the process of transferring from manual to digital base to collect contact and health information was needed?
The process of digitizing the information being collected was necessary to have a functional border and to facilitating the transit of critical services, people, and goods. For example, in the initial days with paper processing, it could take up to 14 days for data to be transferred and processed, and that data was critical to informing the day-to-day border measures, public health measures, and to providing data to our provincial and territorial counterparts for the administration of public health. With the digitization of this data flow and the app, that amount of time decreased to 48 hours on average. Without the app, it would have been impossible to manage the increase that we saw for in May 2020, where we had about 1,000 travelers a day, to January 2023, where we were able to manage 50,000 travelers a day, with processing time that dropped from 7 minutes per traveler to 2 minutes, a really important difference at both air and land borders.
Could you share and enlighten us in respect to the move from manual paper-based to digital? A lot of digitization has happened across government. Is this something that PAC had considered along with CBSA to bring the manual paper-based information online or to an app for collection prior to the pandemic?
I believe my CBSA counterparts have commented on this, but a digital border is very important for the flow of people and goods in a modern economy. So CBSA had indeed been considering the need to move to further digital processing at the border. But with the layering of public health measures and the importance of the border in delaying the entry of variants and monitoring the flow of travelers and of COVID-19 into Canada, it was really critical that those submissions be done in a digital way. So there was a very clear public health rationale for the need to move quickly in the development of the app. By the end, we had 60.3 million digital submissions before measures were lifted.
My understanding around the time frame was that there was 47 days between the pandemic being declared to the launch of the ArriveCAN app. Has your department ever had to turn around a project this quickly, as it did with respect to going from manual to digital based?
This was an unprecedented time, and the speed of the response was really critical given the speed at which the virus moves and the need to facilitate essential travel. The Public Health Agency of Canada did not have the expertise to develop an app of this nature, and for this reason asked the Canadian Border Service Agency to work on the development of the application, while the Public Health Agency focused on the analysis of the measures that needed to be put in place, the implementation of the Quarantine Act and the Orders of Council that really stood up the requirements that needed to operate at the border. It was a collaborative partnership. We worked very closely together in the governance of those arrangements.
Given everything that's happened, the discussion that we are having today, the report from the Auditor General, what do you think is the biggest lesson that PAC has learned from this experience that will help it move forward and perhaps give Canadians some reassurance that the issues and recommendations identified by the AG are being taken seriously?
It is clear that while this was an emergency that pointed to the need for us to rapidly develop tools that we did not have, that having in place the necessary governance with clear roles, responsibilities, and accountabilities, project budgets, and gating would have been essential to ensure that there was adequate oversight of the development of this application from the outset. As a result, we have put in place specific measures in our planning for future emergencies and pandemics to ensure that that is a standard operating procedure. And we are also taking measures to make sure that we have appropriate tools, standard operating procedures, and emergency responses that will allow us to train and ensure our personnel are able to deploy what were a wide range of new measures and tools that were required for COVID-19 in a more expedient way and to adapt them to future crises.
Thank you very much. Suivant, c'est Madame Sinclair-Desgagnés. Vous avez la parole pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for being here for another session of interesting questions following the report tabled by the Auditor General. Ms. Jeffrey, on several occasions during your remarks and when responding to questions here, you talked about the fact that the pandemic was an urgent situation and as if it were an excuse to act fast. Here, we have a contract from Health Canada, contracts that were signed with GC Strategies in January 2019 following a non-competitive process. The amount is $104,000. So we suppose that to go from one amount to another, there's a procurement process that should be respected. Could you provide us details with these types of contracts that PHAC or Health Canada had with GC Strategies? And if so, why was GC Strategies selected for these contracts? Thank you very much for the question. I can assure you that the Public Health Agency of Canada did not sign any contracts with GC Strategies. Never. You are confirming that it never happened. Public health. For example, Mr. Cummins, what can you tell us when you were at the Treasury Board? What can you tell us about any contracts that could have been signed with GC Strategies when you were at the Treasury Board?
So I'm not aware of any contracts that the Public Health Agency of Canada has entered into, and so I don't have details of contracts that they would have had with other departments or agencies.
Donc, vous n'avez aucun
So you do not remember any such thing when you were at the Treasury Board?
So when I was at the Treasury Board Secretariat, I was in the program sector presenting TB submissions to Treasury Board ministers. I was not responsible for app development or contracting at that time.
D'accord, donc aucun souvenir. Parfait.
Very well, you don't remember anything. Okay, in that case, let's ask questions about the application. COVID Alert. What can you tell us about that application, COVID Alert?
So I can answer that. The COVID Alert app was developed as a tool to help limit the spread of COVID-19. It was downloaded about 6.9 million times. More than 58,000 users entered keys into that app. The idea was that it would provide an extra tool to allow Canadians to identify when they might have been exposed to COVID-19. The app was eventually sunset and retired on the 4th of April, given...
Possible de parler plus clairement.
Could you please speak a bit louder and more clearly, please? I'm sorry.
The COVID Alert app was a tool to help Canadians monitor any potential contact or exposure that they had. It supplemented the contact tracing that provinces and territories and local public health had put in place. The way the app worked was that one-time keys were generated when people tested positive through a PCR test for COVID-19, and those that downloaded the app that had been in proximity to those individuals received notifications that they could have been
Question très
exposed.
simple. Est-ce que vous étiez donc la...
Simple question. So PHAC was responsible for this application. What was the responsibility of the different departments?
The agency was not responsible for the COVID Alert app, although we assisted in the development of the public health rationale and its functioning. The COVID Alert app was, I believe, initially developed by the Treasury Board Secretariat and in conjunction with Canadian Digital Services.
Combien de temps j'ai encore, Monsieur le Président?
How much time do I have left, Mr. Chair? 1 minute, 20 seconds. Thank you. Could you tell us about something else? It's still very vague. The arrival of Mr. MacDonald. He was transferred, I believe, from the Canada Border Services Agency to Health Canada. He was in Health Canada, yes. Well, let's let that go. Concerning the COVID alert application, you had a role to play in that application, which was not widely used. And I know that some contracts concerning COVID alert were attributed to GC strategies. Maybe Health Canada was not directly responsible. If you were involved in any way in the management of that application, how come you were not aware of the fact that a contract was awarded to GC Strategies to develop that application?
Of the Public Health Agency was to help to inform the development of the app and the public health objectives of its development, namely to provide an additional tool for Canadians to have information to inform their risk management related to COVID-19. The evolution of the virus and the evolution of the testing methods being used in provinces and territories meant that once PCR testing was no longer the main method of informing Canadians that they had tested positive for COVID, that the app became of less utility.
Excusez-moi, vous répondez pas à la question. Je vous dis.
I'm sorry, you're not answering the question. I'm saying that the contract was awarded to GC Strategies. I'm sorry, your time is up. Your 6 minutes are up already. Mr. Desjardins.
Sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I too want to thank the Auditor General again for being present with us on this important topic. One, I think the Auditor General has heard my comments in the past that I believe is a failure on three fronts. One, a failure to deliver good management. Two, a failure to deliver the best value for Canadian taxpayer dollar. And three, the generational failure and the consecutive failure of governments to finally address the critical underfunding of the public service that has created a vulnerability to which our public service then is forced to contract very expensive and risky management companies, or app development companies in this case, to continue on robbing the public purse. We see this time and time and time again. We've seen it in the Phoenix pay system. We've seen it double under the Conservatives outsourcing. And here we're seeing finally the consequences of a drastic and dramatically underfunded public service. I want to turn our attention to the graph that's outlined in Figure 1.2. In Figure 1.2 on page 7 of the Auditor General's report, it suggests that the Canada Border Service Agency continued to rely heavily on external resources to develop ArriveCAN from April 2020 to March 2023. You could see there in many instances, we're seeing it, at least in some cases, the doubling of the cost that would be associated with development of these kinds of apps internally to the government versus the cost that is present to the government when looking at external contracts. These external contracts balloon dramatically. Look at the Phoenix pay system today, in the billions of dollars originally contracted out by the Conservatives, and we're still dealing with that terrible decision today. And so now we're seeing the Liberals continue in that tradition, continue to underfund our public service, and continue to see what is the worst case scenario for Canadians. I also want to look at a very important fact that I think now that the Public Health Agency of Canada is present here today that I would like to point to. In the Auditor General's findings, it was found that there was actually an instance where the Public Health Agency and the Canadian Border Services actually undertook a process of jointly finding ways to develop this app. But what we found was in that process that they failed to actually come into an agreement of governance, an agreement of budget, an agreement of process, an agreement ultimately as to who was going to be overseeing and operating this project. To the president of the Public Health Agency of Canada, how could it have been for almost a year long that we've seen no formal agreement between Public Health Agency of Canada and the Canadian Border Services in regards to governance. Can you explain why?
We've already acknowledged that it would have been appropriate, and certainly in future we will be putting in place formal governance. What I can say is,
no, it's certainly inappropriate, President. It's inappropriate that this took place. It's not appropriate. I would fail to use that word. I want to understand, why is it that the Public Health Agency undertook a process that didn't involve the appropriate level of good governance? It's established in the report that COVID-19 and the processes to which the Treasury Board undertook to waive or to make more expedient the outputs of the government at this time were not acceptable, or is not an acceptable excuse to avoid good governance models. How is it, again, that the Public Health Agency, knowing that fact, that's a well-established principle of the Treasury Board, was able to come into an agreement with the Canadian Border Service Agency without a formal agreement on governance? Is this directly a failure?
there was close collaboration between the Public Health Agency and the Canadian Border Services Agency in the elaboration and development of ArriveCAN. However, there was no formal project governance put in place and no documentation of those decisions, which the Auditor General has pointed out. We acknowledge that, and we believe that that is a best practice that should be put in place in all future crises, and we have taken steps to ensure that in all future responses that this is part of our standard operating procedure and protocol.
Whose decision was it to not create a formal governance structure?
The intense nature of the collaboration and the development meant that these teams were meeting on a daily or even weekly basis. There was no deliberate decision not to put in place a governance structure.
But if you're meeting that often, Ms. Jeffrey, you must understand the frustration Canadians have and members of Parliament must have when present to a situation where you're meeting in a room every single week and you still fail to, one, address the issues of cost, two, the issues of governance, and three, finally, the ability to actually come into an agreement that actually sees some of these issues having fair oversight, to me seems like a very, very tenuous connection between what you think is good governance and what is truly poor governance. This is a dramatic failure, Ms. Jeffrey, and one that has cost Canadians millions of dollars. We cannot simply say that there was good intention between the CBSA and the Public Health Agency of Canada. They met every week, but failed to address the questions of governance and failed to address the questions of cost. If that's what you're saying is true, then that has to be the case, or we're led to believe that this lack of governance went unquestioned, and the nature of these meetings were really not ones of governance. Which one is it?
I would say that the nature of the meetings at that time in March 2020 were focused on the significant time pressure to develop an app that would allow the border to permit the flow of critical people and goods. And so the operational outcomes were the overriding subject of conversation and the necessity of layering the public health measures. Unfortunately, as we've acknowledged, there was not formal governance throughout that time. And that lack of formal governance.
Did the minister know about that lack of formal governance?
I'm afraid that is the time, Mr. Desjardins. You will get another opportunity down the road.
Thank you, Chair.
Turning now to Mr. Brock, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your attendance. I'd like to open with a comment. For the record, spending under Justin Trudeau's government on outside consultants and contracts has more than doubled, costing taxpayers $20 billion. And now we have a classic example of government waste and abusing the taxpayer. So I'm going to focus my questions to you, Ms. Jeffrey. You mentioned in the earlier rounds that ultimately you report to Minister Hajdu at the time during the implementation of the ArriveCAN app. She was your direct minister. And you also reported to the PCO, the Privy Council Office. Is that correct?
Yes, the role of the President of the Public Health Agency of Canada.
Yeah, and directly reporting to the PCO is the clerk of the Privy Council is who you'd be reporting to, correct?
For the purposes of the administration of the public service.
Right. But during the course of the ArriveCan implementation, you are reporting to the Privy Council office. And you are aware that the Privy Council office literally acts as a deputy minister for the Prime Minister. Is that correct?
The Public Health Agency functions as part of a health portfolio.
I'm not asking you about that, ma'am. I'm asking you about the structure of the Privy Council office. That's the question. And would you agree with me that that really acts as a deputy minister to the Prime Minister?
Yes, that's one of the functions.
Thank you. Now, I want to know, without getting into specifics, I want to know about all the contacts, whether they be telephone, whether they be email, whether they be in person, all the contacts that you had with both Minister Haidu and the clerk of the Privy Council during the implementation of the ArriveCan app. So how frequently, let's start with the Minister Haidu, how frequently were you consulting with her and informing her about the implementation of the app?
So I would just clarify that it would be the role of the president of the Public Health Agency, since I've been in the role for 1 year, so not me personally. However, there was structured COVID governance focused on the measures that were being taken at the border. So here I want to distinguish.
Again, I'm not talking, ma'am, the question is very specific. I'm not talking about content. I'm talking about frequency. So whether you were in the role as the president or the deputy minister at all relevant times or another colleague, how often were you consulting, telephone, email, meetings with Minister Haidu during the implementation of the app, but specifically the 177 versions of the app is the question. Can you provide an answer to that, please?
As it regards to the response to the COVID pandemic, the president of the Public Health Agency would have been in very frequent contact. I can't give a specific number, but in terms of the overall health response, the orders in council that developed the measures at the border, there was established governance that has been publicly disclosed.
Now let's move on to the PCO. Same question, frequency. How often?
There were regular committees and governance structures that met about the COVID response.
Okay. And clearly you were not sharing with either Minister Haidu or the clerk of the Privy Council all of the failings that the Auditor General has identified. Were you?
The responsibility to put in place the governing structure around the development of the app was...
Were you explaining to them about all the failings as identified by the Auditor General? Were you explaining to them that we have no contract, we have no budget? Were you giving some indication that this is really falling off the rails? Did you do that?
We were briefing, I'm sure at the time, on the operational requirement to stand up a digitized mechanism.
Did the minister or the Privy Council, the clerk of the Privy Council, ever ask you about costs? Yes or no?
I was not in the role at the time, so I can't speak to that specifically. But I can say that the development of the app and the time pressures and the operational requirements.
It sounds to me, ma'am.
That is the time, Mr. Brock.
Thank you.
I'm afraid. Ms. Khalid, a good day. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I think I've said this before with other witnesses during committees that we've been able to question. I am very, very disappointed with how this whole procurement process has happened, and with a disregard, in my opinion, for public dollars, for taxpayer dollars, in how we conducted ourselves. But I do want to get to the accountability piece of it, and I know that the Conservatives are doing their thing, but I do want to put the question to our PHAC officials. did the Prime Minister sign off on these contracts?
These contracts were concluded at different levels in the public service.
Did the Prime Minister sign off on them?
No, the Prime Minister is not a signatory to these contracts.
Was a minister a signatory to these contracts?
No.
So this report by the Auditor General, which is a really good report, I think, in terms of a wake-up call to ensure that we are making sure that there's accountability for the dollars that we spend. What steps do you think need to be taken to ensure that that transparency and that accountability occurs going forward?
So both the Auditor General and the Office of the Ombuds for Procurement have made a series of recommendations that are being fully implemented by the Public Health Agency. On our part, we have put in place specific governance and operating procedures around contracting in emergencies to ensure that the lessons of this are incorporated into all future responses. We have stood up a contract review committee that is assessing contracts to make sure we have consistency across our organization. We have put in place training and new governance for quality assurance of contracts and to ensure that documentation is on file. We will be implementing all of the recommendations made by both of those offices in short order.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And with respect to this organization, GC Strategies, in December of last year, our Public Accounts Committee had worked together to ensure that we are continuing to hold the government to account, especially with this issue, and to make sure that we are doing right by taxpayers' dollars. We had put together a motion in a very collaborative fashion to ensure that that we move forward in a good way, and that we are doing the work with respect to that accountability as much as we can. It has come to light, there was an article in Le Journal de Montréal last week, which reported that the founders of GC Strategies received millions in contracts from the Harper government under the name Corridor Systems Consulting. Mr. Chair, given that information, and to continue to add to the context of the work that we have already done on this, I do have a motion that I am moving right now. Pursuant to the motion adopted on December 12th, 2023, in relation to the committee's request for all contracts between a government department, agency, or Crown corporations and GC Strategies, Dalian, and Corridix, that the committee expand this request to include all other companies incorporated by the co-founders of GC Strategies. Chair, I really think that we need to get to the bottom of this. I think we need to understand what is happening here, and I would really like to see us expanding our initial work. I think this committee is doing very, very important work in ensuring that we are getting to the bottom of how our taxpayer dollars are being spent, how efficient they are, and what we can do as a committee to ensure that that we have an accountable, a fair and open and transparent procurement process, and a way of ensuring that we are spending taxpayer dollars with efficiency and with care, because I know that people are really hurting nowadays, and we must ensure that people have the trust in our public institutions to be able to pay their taxes and say, yes, we are running a good, a fair, a transparent country that is here to take care of our needs. And yes, during the pandemic.
Sorry, point of order, Chair.
Just hold on a second, Ms. Khalid. I was just going to cut you off. I think you were wrapping up, and I hear what you're saying, Mr. Genovese. I'm going to come back to you. I did see your hand along with Mr. Desjardins, but just give me a second. I just want to consult with the clerk for a minute. But thank you, Ms. Khalid. Appreciate it. And we have your motion here in both official languages. Just give me 1 second. Mr. Genovese, you had a point of order, and then I do a speaking list, which includes Mr. Desjardins and then yourself.
Yeah, Chair. On a point of order, this is an important motion to discuss. Notice was not provided by it, and I don't think it meets the matter at hand requirements. We are undertaking a study at present of the Auditor General's report. We have the Auditor General and senior officials who have come before us to testify on that. I'll look at historic contracts from one of the same companies, from not even the same, but from some of the principals involved in the present company, is just a very different subject. So I believe that
on
proper
that
notice
same
should
point
have
of
been
order,
given,
Chair.
and we'd be happy to discuss it with proper notice.
Yeah, just hold on. First of all, Mr. Desjardins, did you have your hand up to speak to the motion or point of order?
I have a point of order.
All right, go ahead,
if that's
please.
permissible?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. I'm just looking for a copy of the notice provided both official languages before we debate or entertain that motion, please.
Okay. I'm going to read it, Mr. Desjardins, because I don't know if we have an electronic copy coming right away to you, but we will endeavor to get one to you. It says, pursuant to the motion adopted on December 12, 2023, in relation to the committee's request for all contracts between a government department, agency, or Crown corporations, NGC Strategy, Dalian, and Cordic, that the committee expand this request to include all other companies incorporated by the co-founders of GC Strategies. And we will endeavor to get a copy to you. Un point d'ordre, Madame Sinclair-Degné? Non, juste attends encore.
Chair?
Yes, Ms. Claude, you had a point of order.
Just on the point of order from Mr. Genuis, I do believe that this is very much in line with what we are studying. We are trying to get to the bottom of how contracts are given out, who they're given out to, and it is very strange that a company changes its name and has been operating within the whole procurement network for the past decade at least that we know of. I think this is very much in line with what our original motion was on this. And as you recall, Mr. Chair, over these past number of months, we've been talking about how we can, get to the bottom of this. We've had these conversations. In fact, when a number of times you've called special meetings, Chair, just to get to the bottom of this. And I think that this is going to add to where we go, where our accountability is, and to get to an understanding of what this organization is and why has it been able to operate for so many years under different names, different contexts. And I think that it is incumbent on us as a committee to be able to add to this ArriveCAN study with getting to know what this organization has been and what its history has been as well.
Chair, just to follow up on the point of order.
All right, just briefly, Mr. Genuis, please.
Yes, Ms. Khalid is making arguments about a study happening at the Government Operations Committee. Here at the Public Accounts Committee, the study is on a report.
Sorry.
On
Okay, stop, both of you, please. This is now entering into debates of the merit of the motion, which I think are valid on both sides. I'm going to put this motion aside for now. I'm going to recognize that it has been tabled. I view it as tangential to this meeting, not in line with the business at hand, which is to discuss PHAC and its involvement. So, Mrs. Khalid, while I look forward to having this motion,
Chair,
Ms. Khalid, I have the floor now. I will allow point of orders after. I'm going to give you my ruling. We will pick this up. If members would like to use the 1064 and pick it up on Thursday, I'm available for that or anytime. But this is outside the scope of this meeting. This meeting is focused on business of the ArriveCan app, the Report 1 with PHAC officials. So that is my ruling today. I'm putting this aside. I'm happy to come back to you all Thursday or sooner if you like, although I think it takes 48 hours for a 106.4. But if I get even agreement from other members, I'm happy to schedule a meeting for later this week. So, Ms. Khalid, you have a point of order to my ruling.
Yes, I challenge your ruling, Chair.
Okay. That then calls a vote. And Clerk, I'll turn that over to you. Just give us a second, please. Clerk, which one of these two is?
Shall the ruling of the chair be sustained? Ms. Bradford.
No.
Mr. Chun.
No.
Ms. Khalid.
No.
Ms. Diab.
No.
Ms. Yip.
No.
Mr. McCauley.
Yes, please.
Mr. Brock.
Yes.
Mr. Genuis.
Yes.
Madame Sinclair Desgagnés.
Non.
Mr. Desjaclet.
No.
7 nays, 3 yeas.
Before you read it, turn your mic off for a second.
Okay.
Sorry, Clerk, can you read the final results of that?
Yes, no, I'm just consulting with the clerk here on how I should proceed. But clerk, back to you, please.
7 nays, 3 yeas.
So we are now debating this motion. I'm not entirely sure how long this is going to take, so I'm going to ask our witnesses just to hold for a little bit. I do have a speaking order already, which includes Mr. Desjardins, Mr. Genuis, puis après ça, Madame Sinclair Desgagnés. Mr. Desjardins, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I do believe, given the context of my position and my statement in regards to the origin of this issue, I made and motivated my point very clearly just in the very first round and several times during this investigation already, pointing to the very direct instance where I believe the vulnerability of our public service that creates the kind of risk we're seeing in GC strategy is very relevant. I support this motion because of the intent to get to the bottom of how these individuals at GC strategies were both, one, able to take advantage of our public service, not just once, here, Mr. Chair, but several times. We've seen in the breaking of the story at La Presse in Quebec that there was over $250 million since 2015. Now, prior to that, we're seeing from information I'm gathering from their former name titled Cordial, that from the Conservatives, were able to contract over $7 million, and that's just in our initial findings. It is true that there is a rot in the public service, and that rot's been generational, and I've been clear about that generational rot. And now what we're seeing is both the Liberals and Conservatives being true to what is the very fact of the vulnerability present to our public service. I welcome the Liberals' motion towards transparency, and I'd invite my Conservative colleagues who are also interested in accountability and transparency to really delve deep in your own statements made many, many times about the risk that GC strategies and players like them present, to vote in favor of such a thing. Anything less would be a deflection and would be something to seek to try to hide what is the origin of the very important contractors on the other side of this. These contractors are known to the government, they are known to the Conservative Party, and they were known to the prior government under Harper. We need to get to the bottom of this. I welcome this level of transparency, and I hope that my colleagues do too.
Thank you, Mr. Desjardins. Ms. Khalid, I'll just acknowledge, I see your hand up. You're now third on the list. Mr. Genuis, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple very brief points. Number one, I'm sorry to see what very much appear to be delay tactics from the Liberals. They don't want to hear from the Auditor General. They don't want to allow us to ask questions to the Public Health Agency of Canada, and that's why they're moving this motion in the middle of when we should be questioning witnesses. I'd like us to get back to questioning witnesses, although a lot of things have been said by people in other parties that I don't think are accurate. We're ready to pass this motion and get it done with, having had a couple minutes to look over it. There's nothing objectionable in getting this information. I will just flag, of course, that 2015 was when GC Strategies was incorporated as a company. That's very clear. But look, if there's agreement of the committee now to pass this by unanimous consent, let's do that and get back to work.
I'm seeing a few head nods. I see some, but I believe Ms. Desjardins, Madame Séclading veut prendre la parole. Alors, à votre tour, s'il vous plaît.
Merci.
Thank you. I would like to go fast. We agree with the substance of the motion. However, there are two amendments that I would like to propose. The first amendment, instead of looking into the situation since January 2012, I don't know why that date was chosen. There are contracts that date back to 2007 with the two owners of GC Strategies. So I think we could simply extend the date. We could say since the creation of their businesses. That's the first amendment I'm proposing. I would like a date since the creation of the businesses.
For point of order and held off, so I'll hear from you, Andrew, Mr. Scheer, because you were
just in the copy of the motion that was distributed to members. There's a discrepancy between the English and the French. Mm-hmm. In the English, it doesn't have a start date, and I believe my bloc colleague is trying to amend the start date. So if we go by the English motion, then I don't think the amendment's necessary.
Merci beaucoup. So, Mr. do you have a similar? Okay. Alors,
Si on enlève la...
If we remove the date, that's fine with me. Second, so we remove the date stating since the 1st of January 2012 in French. And the second, one moment, please.
I'm just going to check with Ms. Khalid here. It's her motion. Ms. Khalid, the wording is different. Are you agreeable to removing en français the depuis le 1er janvier 2012 in English, since January 1st, 2012? Could we strike that? I need to bring the motions into alignment.
I think that should be okay, Chair.
Merci beaucoup. Okay. I'm going to consider that done if I don't see any objections. Alors, Claude, votre deuxième amendement?
Oui. Donc, une des raisons...
One of the reasons why we did not receive any response concerning the motion of the 12th of December, 2 months later, it was because there was no deadline for the documents to be provided. So I would like that we add a date so that the government understand that it's urgent for them to provide the documents within reasonable time. So if you would allow me, I would like us to add that the documents should be provided within the 2 weeks following adoption of the motion. Within 2 weeks following adoption of the motion.
That amendment is perfectly.
Sorry.
Just 1 second, Ms. Khalid. I just want to make that amendment is certainly well within order. I'm actually meeting with the clerk and the analyst later this week. We have been. I just want to clarify. We have been receiving documents from the Government of Canada, and they're in the process of being cataloged and to ensure they're in both languages as well and ready to be distributed. They're in a format to be distributed to members. So I expect some of that to come in the days and weeks ahead. Ms. Khalid, I think you indicated you'd like to speak to the amendment to your motion, which is to put a 2-week timeline on this return for documents.
Sorry. So my understanding is that we've got the documents for February 2nd from public safety. I'm just wondering if we can ask for 30 days rather than putting a February 2nd timeline on it.
Can I just ask you, what is your, sorry, you mentioned another committee. What's the relevance of that committee?
No, sorry, we had asked for documents, right, from public safety.
Oh, I think it was from OGO operations, government operations.
Okay, all right, but I would appreciate that as we're trying to get documents in our committee, that we can give days instead of dates, if that makes sense.
And how many you proposed 30 days?
I do, yes.
Okay. In sous-amendement, Madame Sinclair-Desgagnés, avez-vous?
Ms. Sinclair-Desgagnés, do you have any comments on that amendment, on that sub-amendment? And I would like to note something. We have lots of break weeks during the next 2 weeks and 30 days. Go ahead. I accept 30 days. Very well.
Opposition to 30 days? All right. So 30 instead of 2 weeks. Now could I have a vote to pass the amendments / sub-amendment, putting a 30-day deadline on this? I see thumbs going up. Any opposition? That is passed. So now the motion is, well, as it stands, with a 30-day deadline. Any opposition to this motion? I declare it passed. I'm now going to get back to our witnesses. Madame Sinclair-Desgagnés, vous avez la parole pour 2 minutes.
Ms. Sinclair-Desgagnés, 2 minutes, 30 seconds. I want to thank the witnesses who are still here with us. You only have 2 minutes, 30 seconds, so let's not waste your time. My question goes to you, the Auditor General. In your report, and from memory, I think it was 1.46, you said that you also observed that some processes at PACP did not respect the requirements of PSPC when it came to codes for awarding contracts, and you said that KPMG had received contracts without a competitive process. We are not only talking about a non-competitive process that could happen, but there was no documentation explaining why KPMG had been selected. And something else, the contracts had been amended to be more flexible. There were less task descriptions. So this allowed for the use of more public funds in the same contracts. Could you tell us more about that, please? That's a good summary of that paragraph. And I think it's paragraph 50 where we give the list of contracts and where the contracts were amended to provide for more flexibility. On the processes, sometimes this could happen. What I expected was that if the government needs more flexibility, it makes sure that in a contract, task authorizations are specified. This lack of detail is what contributed to the fact that it's difficult to know whether there was good value for money. I would say that these are basic requirements that we expect to see in contracts, things that should not be removed. How do you explain that basic requirements were not respected? As I said last week, I think it is because of the pandemic. People were under pressure to support Canadians quickly and efficiently. And there are lots of regulations that are required for government contracts, but we expect that some basic requirements should be followed. We don't have to complicate it, but there's a need for accountability. But you said that the pandemic should not justify rules being thrown out of the window. We understand that things had to be done fast. We understand that this did not happen only during the pandemic with ArriveCan. It must have happened before the pandemic. Clearly, that doesn't fall directly within the scope of your report, but we want to suppose that, can we suppose that processes were always respected at all times? Well, it's possible that there were some deficiencies before the pandemic. If you look at the report by the ombudsperson looking into larger contracts, larger than ArriveCan at CBSA, clearly there was lack of documentation and some basic requirements were not respected. But I expect a government to use common sense and ensure that there's proper oversight of policies in place instead of simply adding the processes. Thank you very much.
2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I do want to turn our attention now to the Auditor General's reports finding under 1.42, page 11 of the English report. It states that vendors, under the title vendors, we found situations where agency employees were involved in the ArriveCan project, were invited by vendors to dinners and other activities. To the President of the Public Health Agency of Canada, do you or are you aware of any instances where during your time there, before you were the President of the Treasury Board, President of Public Health Agency, and during your time on the Special Task Force for COVID-19 for the very same project under ensuring that people had access to COVID-19 supports, did you find any instances where this became a red flag, and was that red flag reported?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We found no evidence that agency employees or staff received invitation from vendors.
Thank you very much for that. To the Auditor General, what instances, or in your words, what situations where the agency employees who were involved in the ArriveCan project were invited by vendors to dinners and other activities? What evidence do you have to suggest that?
As you know, because the files were so incomplete, we turned to emails, which are transitory typically in nature, and it's in those emails that we saw invitations from 3 or 4 vendors to at least 5 Canada Border Services Agency employees and about a half a dozen other that we couldn't tell if they were part of the Canada Border Service Agency or other departments because their emails extensions were not there.
And so, Ms. Hogan, just to clarify that statement, you're not certain as to whether or not officials outside of the Canadian Border Services Agency, which may include the Public Health Agency of Canada, were invited to such dinners or events?
I am not certain. I can tell you that at least 5 of the employees on the emails that we saw, granted we did not see, potentially see all of them, were Canada Border Services employees.
And to the President of the Public Health Agency of Canada, in instances in your own department where an employee is offered gifts or invitations to dinners, are they reported to you or who are they reported to?
Where gifts are offered to public servants, there is a reporting requirement, and there are also conflict of interest declarations that can be filed, but I'll turn to Martin Crummins to speak to the controls.
So as part of the contracting process at the Public Health Agency, we have a form that requires all managers that are proposing a contract to declare any conflict of interest, and that would be the process that they would.
And thank you. I'm afraid that is the time.
Thank you, Chair.
Turning now to Mr. Genuis. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. What we've seen from Liberals thus far in this testimony is quite incredible. They're trying to limit witness testimony by moving motions in the middle of their testimony. Liberals are also trying to question the core principle of ministerial accountability. They're trying to suggest that ministers are somehow not responsible for what happens in their department. And this is really unprecedented. I think it's clear that in our system of government, ministers have been responsible for what happens in their departments for hundreds of years, but uniquely Liberal ministers think they're not responsible for what happens under them. Ms. Jeffrey, I want to ask, Canadians I talk to are horrified and disgusted by what happened with the ArriveCan app. Do you think those feelings are justified?
We acknowledge that the governance that should have been in place for an IT project of this nature was...
Sorry, I'm gonna jump in. My time is tight. That wasn't my question, right? My question was, Canadians are horrified and disgusted by what happened with this app. Do you think those feelings are justified?
I think that there were many dimensions to the ArriveCan app. I think that there was value in terms of the services that were provided.
Sorry, do you think Canadians are justified in feeling horrified and disgusted?
I can't speak to how Canadians view the app. I can speak to the governance and the project management that was put in place.
Okay, that's a pretty clear non-answer, but we'll move on. There's a remarkable absence of documents, including records of basic communications that you would expect in a case like this. Did you or anyone else at the Public Health Agency of Canada destroy documents related to ArriveCan?
I have no knowledge or evidence of documents having been destroyed, and we have a policy that requires information of business value to be retained.
So you can't say that they were, and you can't say that they weren't, in terms of your own knowledge of documents being destroyed. Is that correct?
I can say we found no evidence of documents have been destroyed.
Okay, but there was such a glaring absence of documentation. Are you concerned that documents may have been destroyed? Do you think it's plausible that absolutely no records were kept in so many of these cases?
What I can say was it was a time of great change at the agency as we responded to the pandemic.
No, but people still have to talk to each other, right? I know, ma'am, I know it was an urgent situation and lots was changing, but people still have to talk to each other. People still send emails back and forth. In times of urgency, I would expect there would still be a lot of communication happening, and yet there's such an absence of information. Are you concerned about the destruction of documents, especially with reports alleging Mindone destroying a large number of emails? And I know that wasn't PACP, but are you concerned about destruction of documents within the Public Health Agency of Canada?
I agree with what the Auditor General has recommended, which is that documentation needs to be provided and to be maintained on file so that when you have change and turnover in personnel, those records are maintained.
That's not really an answer to my question. Can I just quickly flip over to the Auditor General? If you can confirm your previous testimony, the complete absence of documents suggests that either there was a conspicuous lack of records kept or the documents were destroyed, that one of those two things happened, but you weren't able to confirm which. Is that correct?
Well, when documents don't exist, it's either they never existed or they were destroyed. So, and in this case, we can't tell you which it was, but there is a glaring lack of documentation that should be maintained.
Thank you. Back to the President. The app went through 177 different versions, most of which weren't properly tested. You owned the app, so why weren't different versions of the app tested? Why did you not insist on proper testing of the app?
In their testimony that in order to increase the speed by which the versions would be deployed, that they were not all tested.
So you were aware at the time that they weren't being tested, and you were okay with that?
The governance around the project management at the time looked at how the apps were being deployed.
Sorry, I'm looking for clear. Ma'am, I have limited time, and I'm looking for clear answers to clear questions.
I'm going to turn to my colleague Luc Brisbois from the Border Service.
No. I want to hear from PHAC. Over 10,000 people were falsely sent into quarantine because this app was, in most cases, not properly tested. Are you comfortable with that? And did you brief the minister about the lack of testing?
So it's very regrettable. We're obviously not comfortable when people are erroneously advised. In this case, when they arrived in the country, they were given a green check mark, which means they were cleared for entry without isolation periods. There was then an error in the app that resulted in messages being sent out. The Public Health Agency
I'm asking about the testing.
Are you comfortable with the lack of testing? Mr. Juniors, that is your time. Turning now to Ms. Yip. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you for coming. As the pandemic evolved, the government continued to introduce new emergency orders in council, and some of which required adjustments to the ArriveCAN application. What were some of the adjustments that PHAC had to make?
So there were many adjustments throughout the course of the pandemic, with 83 different orders in council to be specific. One of the key ones was moving to a vaccine differentiated border to require proof of vaccination from people entering Canada. In addition, there were requirements subsequently for testing at the border, and there was a time when the use of the app shifted from being voluntary to being mandatory. Each of the OICs was generally in place